Now we're uncredible.
Welcome to the Uncredible Podcast. My name's Jeremy, and I'm Uncredible. So, got some fun stuff to talk about today. Before we get into the Substack, hopefully, I like to share some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and hopefully you're noticing the lighting's getting a little bit better. The last 2 episodes, I've been trying to use a mounted TV that's actually behind the cameras that you can't see. It's sort of like a second monitor for me, and the last couple episodes... I think the timer on the TV went off and I didn't even notice it. Either that or I pulled something up on screen that like the screen went dark and then it literally affected the lighting visual. So what I did 2 weeks ago was I think I just left it. It happened again last week, much earlier in the episode. And what I did was I did a transition from one camera to the other to sort of hide the fact that it happened. Like, because you could literally see, like, I'm sitting here talking and it goes dark and you're like, oh, that's so, like, this is an Uncredible podcast, but I'm trying to avoid some of the obvious mistakes. So today I'm trying something a little bit different. My birthday was last week. I turned 43 and my daughter got me a really cool, I guess they're called, is ring light the right word? It's a light. It's like one of these lights. It's sort of like a selfie thing, which is like one of those things that as a dad who's just goofing around, I'm not going to buy for myself. And I actually had purchased one for her, I think like 2 years ago, because she was trying to do those videos where you open packages and stuff. So we bought her a kit. And a couple weeks ago, maybe it was a month ago, I had asked her, I was like, hey, whatever happened to that ring light? Because one of the things I'm trying to do with this studio is I'm trying to like only use free stuff and not put any money into it. And so I asked her about the ring light because I thought, man, that would help avoid this, because then I could actually use the monitor. I can bring stuff up. So for my birthday, she bought me one of those ring lights. So we're using that on this side. It's probably going to reflect off my glasses. I'm still working on the position of it. So hopefully the lighting's getting a little bit better. Just something we tinker around and play with. I like to share that stuff because I want people to know that anyone can do this. Like, the whole idea behind Uncredible is regular people putting themselves out there, and that story matters. Like, you might not be comfortable in front of a camera and this might not be your thing, but if you're excited about that or you want to share your journey, I think those are the stories that people resonate with more so than like these celebrities who share stories that aren't real, right? Like, I talked with Daryl Perry on his podcast, it was either last week or the week before, about reality TV, how it's literally, we all know it's not real. So getting people to be real and show that this can be done without spending thousands of dollars. And I was so excited that this photo popped up on my Facebook. I shared it on Instagram, where I was wearing the original Uncredible t-shirt, which I don't think I have it anymore. If I do have it, it's in my punching bag, so I bought one of those punching bags like 5 years ago that you have to stuff yourself. And I was like, well, what am I going to stuff it with? Well, I stuffed it with old t-shirts, and that's one of the ones that I may have ended up there, but I think that went long before that. So anyway, in that photo though, it's a birthday photo from when I turned 34. So that would have been 9 years ago. And in the background is all this equipment. Like, it's the best, like, evidence of where I've come from in terms of from then to now, because I had pretty much hung it up at that point. I wasn't doing any of this stuff. That stuff was just sitting on a desk. My laptop, same laptop's in the picture. The desk, ironically, the desk is the same desk that I'm using, except my dad built this tabletop for free. So anyway, all that behind the scenes stuff, just to say you can do stuff like this too. If you're a regular person who's doing anything interesting, put it out there, see what happens. Maybe dabble a little bit on social media and see if anybody's interested in it. And if they are, start playing around. I mean, all of our phones have cameras. I'm literally using phone cameras for this. My literal cell phone is that camera. And then the one my phone prior to that is this one. So now if you look behind me, you notice the aesthetics has changed a little bit. I found a heck of a deal on these chairs, and this is actually the first thing I've spent money on. I'm kind of going through my head, is this true? I'm actually looking around. I keep saying this, and I'm not sure if it's actually true, but that's the first like sum of money I've really spent on this Uncredible podcast. It was $75. So these chairs popped up on Facebook Marketplace for $100, and I'm like, nah, not happening. And I told you last week or the week before that I was trying to fill this back area in because my family took this is where we were storing our outdoor furniture. Well, it's summer, so all the outdoor furniture had to go outside. So now it's like blank and empty in here. So, long story short, I think we got a studio set up now. I think we're in a good place. Now, you'll also notice you'll notice that the clock has moved. There's a reason for that. I don't think it's in camera, but you'll see this. I got this for free a long time ago too, this bounty hunter thing. This is not Mandalorian. This goes way back to ThinkGeek, and I won this as a prize in a call center back in like 2016, had to have been 2016 when I was at the call center. So we had a lot of rain over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, just tons of rain. And I won't go down the whole story because we have a lot to talk about today, and things are going to get a little bit technical later in the episode. But just to give you the behind the scenes, if you look at the paint, it's got to be some of this paint. Maybe not. Maybe I cut it out of the camera. So like this corner of my basement, I've been working on for like 3 years. And it's been an outdoor and indoor project because this corner, when I first moved into the house, was the nastiest, most disgusting corner in the house. And it was the last area that I really dealt with. And part of the reason for that was we get a lot of water. I shouldn't say a lot of water. That's not fair. We get water that seeps in these walls every so often. And what it is my roof off the back side doesn't have good drainage. And when I first moved in, the gutters had been ripped off. And my dad and I had talked about it. And we came to the conclusion that maybe if I had a gutter there, it would redirect the water and I wouldn't have that. And so I ran a test. And keep in mind, when I say ran a test, this was like a multi-year test where I was like, all right, let's clean this area up. It wasn't painted. And just see if we can track where this water's coming from. So the gutters worked great, like 2 years, maybe a year and a half. The gutters did their thing. And I was like, oh, maybe I can start using this area. So I started tinkering around, cleaning it up. What could I put in here? There's also, you can't see it, but there's some piping. You might be able to see that one. There's some piping that runs the baseboard water heat down here that makes the ceiling kind of low. So this was actually going to be the gym initially. It didn't work out. So anyway, long story short, last year we were trying to find a place to put the the furniture from the outdoors. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to set it up like a setup. So I scrubbed the floor. This is actually on Instagram. If you go back like a year, I took a picture of before and after. Scrubbed the floor, painted the walls with kills, and just kind of watched for like a year. Now, the rest of that summer, no water. It was great. That winter, I don't think it was this past winter. It was the winter before. Yeah, it was the winter before that I'd run this, that I had a problem with the water issue. So the winter before, we had a serious ice dam issue. And what happened was the gutters that I put up got so much ice that it literally ripped the fascia, the gutters themselves, and some of the shingles off the back roof. And I told my dad, I was like, well, this is all on Instagram too. If you go back far enough on Instagram, you'll see these photos. I told my dad, I was like, well, I guess I figured out after a couple of years why they didn't have the gutters up on the back. So last winter, I was going to put heat tape up, but the winter came so quick and I was doing the winter beast challenge. I just didn't have time. And I did have to go up there like maybe one time, but I didn't have any ice buildup, as much ice buildup as I did with the gutter. So last winter, I'm like, oh, this works out because it seemed like this drainage issue had stopped and had resolved itself. And then the ice was, and I'm like, okay, so I'm kind of back to a good place. This spring hits, the last couple of weeks. Rain and rain. By the way, the pool story, if you've been following the pool story, also a problem with all the rain. I won't talk about that. This past week, I come down here just after buying, I'm talking 2 or 3 days after buying these chairs. I come down here and I got a pool of water in the corner behind me. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So I figured out like what I need to do. Essentially, I have to find a way to divert the water without gutters I've got some ideas. I actually think I'm going to end up building a kind of like an extended roof off this back corner that will just get the water to get away from the house. But I have a small porch, like a mud room. It's like a flat roof, and it slopes back into this side. So all the water's coming to this corner. So all that to say, as this studio builds out and you see things that look different, and the podcast is called Uncredible, I'm very aware of, like, I want to keep this as real as I can. And I'm going to try to make it as professional as I can, but I always want it to be obvious and known that there's like no decorator. Like, by the way, the story behind these chairs is kind of cool. The guy bought this house down by the lake, and he's using it as an Airbnb. He bought it with all the furniture, and he didn't need these chairs. So he posted them for $100, and I was like, yeah, no way. The price dropped within a week down to 75, and I'm like, $25 per chair is not bad. So I went with it, and I think it looks good. So tell me what you think. But it doesn't matter what you think, because that's what's going to be back here for a while. Now I don't know what I'm going to do with the furniture that comes in at the end of this summer, but I'll deal with that when that time comes. So that's a lot of things to say that we're still keeping it uncredible. And as you see changes behind me or things on the wall, we're not spending a lot of money on those things. $0 for the most part. I guess I could arguably say I've spent about $100 in here. I guess the TV, there you go. The TV I mounted up here, but that's not really for the podcast. It's just, I wanted a TV down here and a second monitor. So you could argue that was another $50, $60 purchase, cheap TV. So, but the point is, I'm doing this on the cheap for a very specific reason. I'm uncredible. You can do this too. Now, let's get into the Substack. What we got going on next week is an article I brought up last week in our main topic when I was talking about AI, but I didn't really talk about the article specifically. So next week, the Wednesday main article for the week is going to be called Boomers, We've Got This. By the way, if you see me looking over here a lot, today I have a lot of notes and I want to keep to them because I think I could run the risk of going too long today. And a lot of this stuff I'm going to speed through, and I've already wasted too much time on talking about chairs. So, but next week, we're going to have an article called Boomers, We've Got This. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about for about a decade, I would say. But something I started thinking about is this Iran war has continued to kind of devolve. That's the best word I can think of. It's not, I don't think the American public is for it. I think there's a very small niche group of people who support this war. I think there's another, third of people who are going along with it because it's Trump and I voted for him or something. I didn't vote for him, but people who voted for him feel obligated to support it. But I feel like the vast majority of working middle class, Gen X, millennial, and lower age groups are kind of like over this thing. Like, we don't get it. We don't understand it. I know I don't. I mean, I understand it, but I understand it as something that boomers want to do. And that's my perception of it. It seems like there's a small group of Gen Xers that are in it too. But it would be interesting if you're watching this and you're a millennial or something less than that, like age-wise lower than that. Who is the millennial supporter, or I don't know what the generations after me are. That's pretty bad. But like Gen Y, whatever they are, whatever those generations are that come after millennials, who would be the biggest proponent of the Israel-Iran war, U.S.-Israel-Iran war, like the most prominent person who supports it? And listen, I know there are some people who do it, but I don't see them. What I see and what I bump into and what I run into on podcasts and social media are 50 and up people talking about this. And the people who support it, I mean, there's not a lot of them that I see that I would go, oh, yeah, no, he's of my generation. So I don't think it's a generational thing, but I just don't think the support is there. And so all that to say, I wrote this article because back when I was doing my previous podcast, I remember doing this thing where I was like, boomers talk like they do all this work and they're tough And at the time, it's definitely more so now, you would get boomers who would say things like, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get a job and work 2 jobs. And when I was your age, and those kind of like comments. And it was kind of ingrained in us that we had to work hard. And then the more I thought about it, they used to, I remember how boomers used to talk about people who were on food stamps and on government assistance, and particularly conservatives. And I got to thinking about it. I was like, Social Security is like, it's in terms of difference, there isn't any. And their argument would be like, well, we paid into it. And then I was like, you also expended all those expenditures. Like, you paid into it and overspent it and left the debt with us. And we're the ones who are having to carry that load now. Like, you're riding off into the sunset telling us we need to work harder when you're not doing anything. It's like, at this point. So back then it was sort of like a chip on my shoulder. Like, like, what are you talking about? Like, we're the only ones who are actively serving in the military. Our generations are the ones who are struggling to buy homes and raise our kids and raise our families and all that. So, like, what are you talking about? Like, it was, and you guys are living off of, Social Security, which is government assistance. So it's like you can't do that. So now I'm looking at it again through the eyes of like what appears to me a dying boomer generation, obviously, in terms of age, but also in terms of like influence. Like, I'm noticing both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, what once was understood to be like, you have to believe XYZ in order to be a part of this party. It's changing. It's fundamentally changing. And things like support for Israel in terms of like defending them and going up against Muslim countries, that's not going to hold up anymore. That generation of thinking is gone, or its influence is falling apart. So I wrote this article because I remember when I did my episode, or I did like a short blip, I think like a 5-minute clip on, it's kind of like, hey boomers, who do you think you are? Like you're on government assistance too. We're the ones doing all the work now. Like, what are you talking about? Looking back on it, I was like, you know what? As I get older, it's like, I can understand how that would sound coming from like somebody who was the next generation. Like, listen, kid, you don't know what I've done, right? Like, I can see, like, if my son was saying that to me, I'd be like, okay. But now I'm looking at it and I'm going, listen, there's more going on here than just an age difference. They had parents too. And their parents were the greatest generation, the ones who fought in World War II, the ones who fought in World War I, who their grandparents went through the Great Depression. So they have a shadow cast over them, because it's like they're trying to live up to something, and their generation never really had to. You had Vietnam, which is kind of looked at, well, it's definitely looked at as a failed war. We're stacking them now. It's almost like they want to have their own war so they can be war heroes. It's a weird thing. But all that to say, like, as a father who's getting older, I look at the generations who are holding on to political power, corporate power, and I'm like, you can step down now. You did a good job. It's okay. And so I wrote this article, Boomers, We've Got This, kind of trying to be respectful, but also like, it's time. Like, it's time for you to step back and trust, if nothing else, what you did in raising the next generation. So next generation, plural. So yeah, Boomers, We've Got This. Uncredible, the book, preview number 5, which is going to be another preview of chapter 1. I almost didn't think I was going to get this done. And I got on a roll last week on writing chapter 1. And kind of restructured the book a little bit, and it looks like it's going to be a lot longer than I had originally anticipated. But originally I was going to do like 3 chapters that were like work, religious experience, and then health experience. Now it looks like it's going to be more like parts with multiple chapters. So chapter 1, the first preview for that is up. Preview number 5 will be coming. And I've got those on the Substack, uncredible.me, in their own. When you go to the homepage, it's got its own track. So you can just click on it on that one topic and then go through them if you want. Also on the Uncredible Readings site, which is on Spotify, you can just listen to all of them there too. So all the audio is going to be available. Uncredible clips from episode 3 are coming, and I'll tell you, the clips, I'm trying to find time to do that. It doesn't seem like something that should be that difficult to put together, but man, is it frustrating to try to get these clips together. My hope this past week was to get clips from episode 2 and episode 22 up so that I'm doing current clips as well as past clips, and then in about 20 weeks, I can just sort of not have to do the past ones, but I didn't get time to do it. So maybe this week I'll do 3 and 23. If you're signed up and subscribed to the Substack, I am not sending those emails out. They're going to be on the Substack, but I don't feel right sending an email about the podcast episode and then later sending an email about the highlights from the episode. That just seems like too much. So, we're going to stick to the 2 to 3 emails a week, for the subscribers. If you're not subscribed, get up there, get on uncredible.me, get on the Substack, check it out. I was going to do that this week, but I decided not to because our main topic and our news topic are pretty lengthy. But I have been working on an Uncredible album. The album is called The Uncredible. Last week we changed the intro music to the podcast, which is part of the first track for the Uncredible album. And I've been playing around with AI music generation, writing my own lyrics, and it's coming together pretty nice. So what I'm going to be doing is, I think for the next few weeks, I was going to start this week. I decided too much going on in this episode for that. So starting next week, I'm going to start debuting one song from the Uncredible album. And then I also have, as I've been building these songs, I've done 2 versions of each song. So I haven't fully decided how I'm going to actually release them. I'm going to share them on the podcast. I'll probably put videos on YouTube, some clips on Instagram. I want them to be able to be downloaded. I'm not interested right now in... So there's a way to distribute so that it ends up on Spotify. And the problem with that is I'm not interested in becoming a musician or an artist. I just want this one album that encapsulates the idea of Uncredible as something that people can run with, as runners, that people can listen to at work, if they're allowed to listen at work. And that captures what it feels like to be uncredible, what I think it feels like to be uncredible in a workspace, managers, all of that. Just what it's like to just be a regular guy working. So I'm trying to capture that, and I think I've done a pretty good job. So I've got 2 albums. One is The Uncredible, and then The Uncredible Remix. Same songs with different styles so people can listen to them. So the reason I don't want to distribute to Spotify, I want to distribute to Spotify and all that stuff. The problem is there's like a cost. And one of my goals is to not put money into this. So basically what I'm going to do is, as I release these, if you're interested in supporting that project and getting it on Spotify, I'm going to basically explain down the road what that costs, how you can support it, and then if we support it, how we can get each song distributed that way. Because part of the problem is these distributor companies or whatever, the cheapest one, he ends up paying like $100 a year. And like there's plans where the tricky thing is, once you put them up, you have to keep the subscription as long as you want it up. There are ways around that. You can pay even more money to keep it up forever, I guess. It's called a legacy thing, but I'm going to look into all that. And then as I release the singles from the album, I'll explain what I need to see happen in order for that. And basically it'll either take off or it won't. And if it doesn't, I'll have some pretty cool songs that I created for my own playlist for when I run. And if it does take off, we'll get it on Spotify. We'll get it out there and see how that goes. So next week we'll be debuting track 1 from the Uncredible album, and it's called The Uncredible. So you've already heard a little bit of it in the intro. All right, now let's get into our weekly update. I'm going to try to speed through the weekly update this week because we have a because the topic that we're going to talk about today in the main topic and in the news is so big, I've actually merged the two and I've eliminated the podcast feature. So I want to speed through this, but I also want to give you, it's been a good week of running. So I want to give you a good look at how this doesn't seem right, but it is the end of week 5 marathon training. So last Saturday, I think I said in the podcast last week, I would gauge where I'm at by that run. And it went great. I mean, I even wrote my notes. It was a 17-mile long run. I completed a stretch of road that I've been trying to complete for a while. Completed that stretch. It was 17 miles long, and I felt good. I think I got the fueling right. I think I got out early enough that the sun didn't beat me up too badly. And I just, best long run block. And so I'm going to attempt that same exact run. This either today, I'm recording this on Saturday, which is not typical. I'm either going to do that today or tomorrow, maybe tonight or tomorrow, one or the other, because I'm trying to avoid the heat. It might rain today, so that might make it a little easier. So I'm going to try to do that again. My mileage, I am for the first time over 40 miles in a week and not sick. Not sick or injured. I do have some lingering calf pain right now, which is why I don't want to do. I could do it. I just don't think it's a good idea to go out there and run my 17-miler. I'll explain that more here in a minute. But this week, my mileage should clear 45, might even get to 50, depending on how my long run goes today and tomorrow. So I am on pace, though, for 43 to 45, and that would be back-to-back this year. That might be my 2 longest runs. Now, the reason that's good is I'm training for my 3rd marathon, which is coming up in about a month, almost exactly a month, just under a month, July 25th. And I'm coming off of my 2nd marathon, which was at the end of May. So I only had really like a little more than 2 months to train for this. And I was a little concerned that might not be enough time to recover. But I think the strategy, time will tell, but I think the strategy I've used of getting longer and slower. So having longer duration runs with a slower pace has allowed me to keep my legs from falling apart completely on me while also gaining that mileage. And I'm hoping instead of chasing pace, I can chase, how do I want to say this? I can chase feeling good. And I don't mean feeling good in the sense that like, hey, this is fun. But I mean like not cramping, not pulling muscles, not super sore. I want to be able to get to the end of this next marathon and just be in a good place physically. And hopefully do that at a pace that's like 10:30 to 11, but not worried about the pace at all. So what I found is even on these runs that I've done where I've intentionally walked for long segments, like sometimes what I'll do is when I go to take my gel, I'll just walk till the gel's done. Or if I need a drink, I'll walk that section. This 17-mile track that I've been doing, I don't know what to call it, this route, I guess, that has a lot of hills too, so I just walk the hills. It's okay. And what I found is that in the end, I still end up with like an 11:15, 11:20 pace. And it's encouraging because I'm not trying to run fast at all in any of it. So the theory is, for me, get out there, go do the marathon. It's going to be mostly flat. Get out there, do these 10s, 10:30s, maybe some 12s, whatever. Let's not hang our head when we hit a 12 if I have to walk for a little bit. And as we get to mile 20, say, hey, let's run as fast as we can from here on out. And that's my hope. That's my goal. So yeah, last week I did 17. Sunday I did 5 1/4. That was interesting because I did the 17 on Saturday, went right back into a 5-miler on Sunday, and I was sore, but not terrible. And I'm telling you, when you finish a marathon and you've put forth a lot of effort, it does take like a week or two to kind of like recover just your legs to feel normal. I went 17 to 5 back-to-back days and felt okay. Now, Monday was when I had to deal with these wall leaks, so I didn't run at all on Monday, so I took a day off. Tuesday, I went and did probably too aggressive of an 8-mile run, but Tuesday was my birthday, and I wanted to challenge myself to do something. You got people doing all these weird challenges online where they run their kilometers or their miles of their age. At 43, I'm not going to go out and just for the fun of it on a Tuesday run a marathon or an ultra marathon. Just not going to happen. So what I did was I chased some records on some hills nearby here that are part of that long run I'm going to do today. I discovered those stretches when I did the long run. And I was like, oh, I think I'm just going to run and hit 2 of those. And I did. I jumped from like 30th and 20th to 13th overall on those. So that was kind of cool. So that was my birthday miles. Wednesday, I just took it easy, did 3.5. My goal Wednesday was actually 8, and I just was not feeling it. Time got away from me. I think Wednesday was the day I got into something on Wednesday. I don't have it written down, so it couldn't have been that important. But so I got way behind. It might have been between recording. I might have started doing the clips. Like I said, getting these clips shouldn't take that long. But I got into something, a project down here. And I remember looking at my watch going, oof, I don't have time for 8. And then I got out there and I was like, 8's not happening. So I just took my 3.5 mile route. Thursday, which was yesterday, or no, it was 2 days ago, I did 7 easy. And then I guess I never updated my note here. But yeah, so basically Tuesday I did 8, Wednesday I did 3.5, Thursday I did 7, and then yesterday I did 7 as well. So feeling good. I'm ready to go. I think I have like 27 miles on the week with 2 days to go. Basically my takeaway, the mileage is increasing. I'm using easier paces. I have less soreness, and the more mileage per week is going good. I'm not sure my speed's getting any better. So the goal is not so much to run fast as it is to run further. And I think if I can accomplish that in this training block, it puts me in a really good place for the next longer training block leading up to Marine Corps Marathon, where I can maybe chase pace and distance. And I have like I said, it's a much longer training block. But so far, I think what I've done for this 8 to 9 week training block is working. Time will tell. We'll see. I thought that with Buffalo too, but I definitely feel a lot less sore than I did heading into Buffalo. And so like the long run that felt good training for Buffalo, if I go back and I look at my Strava stats and I listen to the podcast and the reviews and stuff, like what I was saying to myself, I was hurting pretty bad. If I'm honest, my right leg was in really bad shape. Right now, I do have some mild calf pain and some mild hip pain. Nothing that I can't stretch out and run through. And that's knowing that I have at least a 1 week, maybe a 2 week taper coming before it. I feel pretty good where I'm at right now. So yeah, so that's basically where we're at with the running. So now we're going to transition. We're going to do something that hopefully I won't do on a regular basis. I've tried to avoid doing this. I don't want this podcast to become what it's going to be today. However, when the news and the main topic come for you in the way that this week's news and main topic came to me, you just got to lean into it. So let's get into our uncredible take on the news. And what we're going to do this week is we're going to actually merge the news story and our main topic. So they're going to be merged, but I'm going to treat this first section as how I came about and heard about this news and just give you my take on what was going on in the news. So let's get into that. Let's get into our uncredible take on the news. So I came about this news piece. I don't know if it's a news piece, but this week was weird because I was struggling. It was my birthday week. Things were kind of off. I took Sunday night off of work, and I was struggling to come up with anything. And it was one of those weeks where I thought, I think Tuesday, I don't know when, it might have been Wednesday morning, Tuesday. It had to have been Tuesday morning. Is that right? Monday night, Tuesday. Maybe it was Wednesday morning. One of the two. So I'm getting to the end of my shift, kind of looking at a blank. I use Google Keep to track my notes, and I'm looking at this blank Google Keep, and I was like, what am I going to talk about? I don't want to talk about the Iran war, and there really hadn't been too much news from the Iran war, so I was like, It's like, I really don't want to get into that. So what else could I talk about? I had nothing for the podcast feature. Again, I didn't want to repeat some old stuff, and I hadn't really been listening to new stuff. And I was like, what am I going to talk about? And so the way it works at my work is I go in at night, and then I leave in the morning, and there's a half an hour overlap in the morning between first shift and myself. And so first shift was coming in, and there's a gentleman who comes in and talks about all kinds of random stuff. He has kind of a religious background. I think he attends my parents' church. So every once in a while, he and I will just start talking about religious stuff. And usually, and I don't initiate that stuff anymore. I just let it come to me if it comes to me. But so he comes in and he starts talking about dispensationalism like out of the blue. And I'm like, he's like, yeah, I watched a Tucker Carlson episode. I'm like, Tucker Carlson was talking about dispensationalism. Now, keep in mind, we did touch on this a little bit back in episode 7 of the Uncredible Podcast. I would encourage you to go back and check it out. I'll try to link that in the show notes as well. But I tried to just sort of dabble into it because it was the first time that I had ever heard anyone talk about dispensationalism outside of a seminary class or out of a church setting. And we'll get to this in a minute, but I had never, my concerns with dispensationalism have been basically ignored, both at a professional and a household level. We'll put it that way. When I was in master's degree seminary, I shouldn't say master's seminary because there's actually a seminary called that. When I was in seminary to get my master's degree, I was dealing with this at a collegiate master's theological level. And when I was pastoring a church, I was dealing with it like the small town, small church level, where I was trying to kind of pull this out of like doctrinal statements and stuff, and was wildly unsuccessful at both because it had taken such a root in those churches and in those seminaries that I was the oddball out. It's one of the main reasons I don't pastor and I don't do church stuff anymore, is because of this issue. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But out of nowhere, I'm having a conversation at work about dispensationalism. And I'm like, it's like, what is happening? Like, normal church folks, when I used to bring up dispensationalism, would immediately roll their eyes. Let me throw some terms at you for a minute. Eschatology, soteriology, hamartiology, bibliology, dispensationalism, Calvinism. These words, if you brought them up in a sermon, you could literally watch the eyes of people glaze over, and so we're talking about this, and he mentions Tucker Carlson. I'm like, who is he talking to about dispensationalism? Because I'm like, I'm interested. Like, I want to know. I'm delighted that this is coming up in public discourse, because I was warning about this at a very small scale back in 2014, 2015, 2016, and nobody would listen. So I'm like, oh, so who's finally figuring this out? And he actually pulls up his phone because he couldn't remember, and he goes, he did an interview with J.D. Hall. And I'm like, you got that wrong. I was like, there's no way. I was like, that can't be true. But I'm at the end of my shift, so I have to leave. I have to punch out and leave. So I'm like, in the back of my head, I'm like, he can't mean the J.D. Hall that I interviewed back in 2015, could he? So I dig through and I pull it up, and it says Tucker Carlson, J.D. Hall, dispensationalism. Hold on. This is crazy. Play the episode. Sure enough, there's J.D. Hall on the Tucker Carlson show talking about dispensationalism. Now, it's like when you're trying to find something to talk about and it just falls in your lap, it's like, oh, perfect. So we'll throw things back a little bit to 2015. Back then, there was a lot of debate going on with some of the cultural issues politically. So homosexuality, abortion, trying to think what other ones. Those were the two big ones. And there was a lot of conversation about it. And I know it was on the abortion issue that I think it was Focus on the Family was taking sort of a middle road on abortion. It was weird, man. It was one of these things where it was like, who are they trying to impress with this? I can't remember. It was sort of like, It was a really watered down version. Now, regardless of where you stand on abortion, it's like the middle ground people are the ones that disgust me the most, because it's like, pick a side, bro. Like, you can't walk the middle road. And that's what a lot of people do in order to seem, let me put it this way. That's what a lot of people do in order to get funding, right? They soft pedal their position so they can get funding for their nonprofit. That's the reality of what happens. So anyway, I interviewed JD because he was like, for whatever you might think about JD Hall, which most people probably don't think anything about him. I don't know how prominent he is now, but there were it was controversial for me to have him on there. But one thing I've always appreciated about JD is his willingness to say very explicitly, straightforward, what he's thinking and how he feels, and has well thought out positions. So like, he's not speaking from ignorance. He's thought things through, and excuse me. He's confident in what he believes. He might not always be right, but he doesn't soft pedal anything. And I've always appreciated that about him, but I thought he was gone from public life. Now, part of that's me just not dealing with church stuff anymore, but I thought he had been, removed from church, and I went back and I did some research, and he had. We'll talk about that in a little bit here, but here I am listening to JD Hall, and listen, he did a great job for the most part on Tucker's show, kind of giving we'll say a historical synopsis of how dispensationalism, at least one perspective of how dispensationalism took root in what he called low church, which I think is, I don't know, I don't know how you describe, sorry, I got something in my throat. I don't know how you describe small church culture. Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, congregational churches, the ones that are on every corner, still surviving with 40 to 50 people supporting it, most of whom are elderly. They do their vacation Bible schools. I don't know how to describe it. Low church is fine. It's the opposite of highly organized, ritualistic, what you would think of with Catholic churches or Eastern Orthodox churches. Just people who show up and do church, So I don't know how you would describe that, but I think he did a good job kind of laying out how dispensationalism took root in America. The tricky thing about it was, as I'm listening to it, and I did some research and I looked it up, I was like, is JD really the best guy for this? Now, I want to avoid two things, because I think he made this mistake. I don't know if it was a mistake. I think it might have been time constraint. I'm not sure. But I want to avoid committing what is oftentimes called like either ad hominem or an attack on the person. I have always liked JD in general, mainly because of his boldness, and he's always been really good at describing obscure historical figures. Like, just really good at that. In fact, towards the middle of my previous podcast, I was using a quote from JD, one of his sermons. I can't remember the name of the reformer. It was a Baptist reformer. It was a powerful message, and I was using it as part of my intro at the time. And I will say this, the whole idea of Uncredible came from, as a small church pastor, trying to reach out to big name, popularized theologians and trying to get them on the podcast, and just be complete, like, you couldn't even have a conversation with these people online. There was just no access to them. That's really where I started interviewing regular people, because they were like too good or too far up the chain in order to deal with regular folk like me. And then I reach out to JD Hall, who in my mind was sort of in the mid tier of that. And he was like, yeah, I'll come on the podcast. So I've always appreciated that about him. and he went through a rough patch. I don't know. Maybe I'm soft pedaling that, but when I had him on my podcast, there was a major controversy surrounding it. And then it kind of went away because I walked away from it. I was like, I don't want to be accused of ad hominem or genetic, which is what I think fallacies, which ad hominem is when you attack the person, and genetic is when you attack the origins of a position, where it came from. So, because I think both of these mistakes were made in this interview, but all that to say, it's curious to me that Tucker chose J.D. Hall for this conversation. They must know each other somehow. J.D. was in Montana pastoring. I think I looked it up. I couldn't find anything off the cuff in terms of Tucker's connection with Montana, but somehow these guys got to know each other because, like, in terms of like public life, I don't think J.D. Hall's out there, and now he is, which is fine. Whatever, good for him, right? Like, the thing is, J.D. Hall has a pretty tattered past, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that's going to affect the reception of his critique of dispensationalism, because people aren't going to listen to his critique of dispensationalism. They're going to attack him because of his past. Whether he sorted that out or not, I don't know. I went on Twitter, X, whatever, briefly to see what was going on, and this is what's happening. So J.D. Hall, if you look him up, just type in J.D. Hall scandal, you'll find that he was involved with, there was legal disputes, something to do with finances with his church, taking money from the church. I think he admitted all of it. I'm not sure. It wasn't pretty. Let's put it that way. And that happened maybe a year after I had him on my podcast. I don't regret to this day having him on the podcast because I think what we talked about was good, but and I think it needed to be said. It would be well received now, but back then it was not well received, particularly in the Christian culture at the time. Maybe it wouldn't today, but anyway. So, like I said, the thing that was curious to me is why him, because he is fine in terms of his knowledge, ability to communicate, maybe a little conspiratorial, but anymore, that's like, if you're conspiratorial a little bit, you're probably right, kind of a thing. And I thought generally speaking, when I listened to the interview, he did a really good job. I find it curious that he's the one that, and maybe there's been other episodes of Tucker Carlson where he dove into this subject matter, but this is the first time I've heard of it. And more importantly, the type of person that this needs to influence in order to get them to stop this stuff, in order to take away the support of a nation that's doing things that might not be moral or ethical. Israel is who we're talking about there. It needs to reach these people, and one of those people, unprovoked by me, starts talking to me about this. And so that's good. Now, I thought it was odd that it showed up. Like I said, in episode 7, we talked a little bit about this as well. This dispensational thing was popping up on some smaller podcast news sites. So I addressed it there. And I think there's some good conversation to be had there. So check that out. But JD did a really good job. I think there's a lot of people who don't like him because of his past. There's a lot of people who I think might be jealous that he's the one that got chosen for this. They had to know each other, or maybe he reached out to Tucker. I don't know how they know each other, but listen, he did a good job explaining Darby and Scoffield. So if you didn't listen to the podcast, go check it out. I personally, as somebody who, we'll talk about this in the main topic, but as somebody who has a background and who has studied at a theological level, dispensationalism, would not have started there. I'll explain why in a little bit. But I did learn something. So he talked a little bit about C.I. Scofield and his background, and I didn't know some of that stuff. And he's always had, like I said, JD has always had a particular gift at bringing these obscure historical figures in a bringing them forward and into the light in a compelling way. And I really appreciated the fact that he did it, from what I could tell, a fairly humble position, because Tucker, he made some comment about how Scoffield was kind of like a low level type person, and maybe a sketchy guy. And Tucker was kind of trying to latch onto that, and he walked him back on that. And I thought that was admirable, because he also did not want to commit an ad hominem attack on Scoffield. He was just trying to say he wasn't the best of guys to be associating with in terms of his morals and his ethics. And I don't think he meant that. I don't think Hall meant that in a way that was to discredit him because of that, but just to say, if you have a Scoffield study Bible, you might be good to know the history behind the guy whose name is printed on it. In the same way, if you're people who are just for the first time interacting with J.D. Hall on the Tucker Carlson show would also do well to do the same. So that's just, use the logic. And I don't know what happened with JD since 2016. So maybe he's fully restored and he's fine. I don't know what his background is. I think it's a weird setup where he does a really good job presenting an opposition position. And let me say this. I thought it was a really good follow-up to Tucker's interview with Huckabee. I kind of wish this interview had happened before he went to talk to Huckabee, because I think that would have been a more interesting conversation. I think Tucker missed a lot of things when he interviewed Huckabee because of his lack of knowledge of this subject matter. And that's not to say Tucker's dumb. Tucker Carlson is on a journey that happened, a theological journey that has already happened historically. He's figuring it out in real time, and it's weird, but he's in 2010, 2015 right now. He's getting there, but it's like he's on a spiritual journey. It's a healthy spiritual journey. He's questioning things in the way he should question them. And he's coming to what appears to be, Tucker's really good at asking questions too, but it appears to be he's beginning to understand some of the ins and outs of Protestantism, evangelicalism, and some of the theological shadiness that goes on there. So that's at least what it seems like in his moments of where he sounds himself. So what else do I have here? I also thought JD did a good job pointing out the correlation between evangelical theology, particularly in the dispensational premillennial viewpoints, and Israel politically. There is something going on there. I don't think it's as intentional or as conspiratorial as they implied. So a lot of the podcasts today that are doing news and stuff are really good at being like, oh, well, what does that mean? What could that possibly mean? Well, I think we know what it means. It's like, you're not saying it. Your Candace Owens, your any of these people who are doing, like, I don't want to say conspiratorial, but they're constantly like questioning things, sort of like a skeptical perspective on all things, never quite stating their conclusion, never quite proving anything, but never quite disproving anything, but just asking perpetual questions, which need to be asked, but also need to be answered in such a way that you have like some way of determining whether or not the person's right or wrong. So that sort of seemed like what was happening here. It's sort of like, was there like Israeli involvement in in perpetrating dispensational theology and inserting that into the Christian church? I'm telling you right now, there is no way. There is no way. I'll explain why in a minute. I'm sure they have leveraged it, but what is dispensationalism and the way it has taken root could not have been intentional. It could not have been. And I speak as somebody who was deeply, deeply involved with it while always questioning it along the way. So I think a lot of people, I would love to know JD's background with dispensationalism, because if you come to dispensationalism from the outside, you having never really been indoctrinated with it, you're going to have a different analysis of the thing. So, like, listening to JD talk, it seems to me like he has, for the most part, looked at dispensationalism as a student, as a critic, but never, maybe he has, but never really been with the people who at all levels taught it. I have not only been in the churches most of my life, I studied in the colleges. I got a master's degree, theological degree, in a seminary, in a dispensational school. I've seen it firsthand. And we're going to talk about some of the comments. We'll pull up some clips here in a bit. But it's not, if it is a lie, like, go back a couple episodes to where I talked about saying somebody's lying is a weird thing to say because you don't know their motives. You have to know that they know better. The idea that somebody is intentionally being deceptive is tough to prove. And I'm telling you that there probably are people who are leveraging dispensationalism theology, more to the point, evangelical theology, for their purposes. But I think the people who believe it actually believe it. For better or for worse, I think they actually have come to that conclusion. I'll explain a little bit in our main topic. But for the news portion of this, what I simply wanted to talk about was that this is in the news. That, look, Tucker Carlson's one of the number one podcasts. Him talking about this means it's going to get brought up in other shows. It's probably going to end up on Piers Morgan Uncensored. It's probably going to end up, I mean, it's already, I can see it's already hitting some of the Christian circles the way it used to, which is wild. Twitter, if you go down that road, it's like the embers were always there and all the same people are mad about it. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But overall, just in terms of looking at Tucker's interview with J.D. Hall, overall, I think J.D. did a good general synopsis of historical dispensationalism. I say historical because I don't think he made it past Scoffield in the conversation, which is unfortunate because I would have liked to have seen him do what I'm about to do, and talk about Charles Ryrie and he didn't talk about Clarence Larkin. He didn't talk about Ryrie and Macarthur, or he mentions Sproul and Macarthur, but doesn't really get into how modern dispensationalism is sort of very subtly inserted into most churches. He mentions it, but he doesn't explain how, and there's very few specifics. We're going to get into some of those specifics here for our main topic, but in terms of the news aspect, I just put in my notes, my uncredible take on this whole interview was, while I've always appreciated JD's candor, perspective, and willingness to incite, I use that specifically. I think his Substack has something to do with inciting, and it's perfect for him. I feel like the low-hanging fruit of JD's past makes this an easy target for ad hominem arguments, and it's already happening. Like, instead of taking JD Hall on in terms of the dispensational theological aspect, or defending dispensationalism, or coming up with reasons why JD was wrong, they're just dealing with his past or who he is as a person. So that's actually going to detract from what he says, because being opposed to dispensationalism is now going to associate you in a lot of people's minds with JD Hall. And here's the track that people are going to go down. This gentleman that came to hear this conversation for the first time was telling me things that I know for a fact 2 weeks prior he would have not said. Saying things like, well, Israel, the Bible isn't the Israel of today. Like, I guarantee you, prior to hearing this conversation, if I had said that to him, he would have been like, oh, I don't know about that. But now that he hears J.D. Hall and Tucker Carlson say it, now here's the pathway. Then he's later going to find out about JD's past and go, oh, that guy might have been crazy, and he's going to fall right back into his old ways. That's why I don't know if, while JD did a great job, I don't know if he was the best spokesperson for it, but he's not the type of person to walk away either. I mean, if good can come from it, then let good come from it. I'm happy about that. But I do worry, it would have been nice if, again, I don't know what JD's public life has looked like since 2016, but what would have been really nice is if they had started out by talking about his past and how he's recovered, and maybe he has, and maybe that there's a cool story there, a redemption story there, which makes it make sense, to where he could have inserted that into this conversation. It didn't happen. So we don't know. I don't know. And I could dig into it, but this podcast is uncredible. So, I'll say this. It was nice to sit there and listen to somebody I had spoken to on a podcast 11 years ago. Is that right? 2015? Yeah, 11 years ago. And Tucker, he's on Tucker Carlson. Good for him in that respect. I hope that he continues to have the opportunity to speak, which I don't think a lot of people are saying. Like I said, I've always liked J.D. Hall. Appreciated his ministry. I know he went through some pretty rough things. He made some, I won't even say mistakes. He would, if I know J.D. Hall, he would not only say he made mistakes, but he did wrong. He knows it, and he's probably would argue that he repented of it and he's moved forward from there. That is the gospel. That is the Christian faith, is that we sin, we seek redemption in Christ, and we move forward. And if that's what he's done, and now he's being called on a decade or more later to discuss this issue, which has very real geopolitical ramifications. Lives are being lost. And if I know anything about JD, he cares about that. He really does. Like, that's not a joke. He cares about it. His heart, at least at that level, is in the right place. So that would be my assessment of JD Hall on Tucker Carlson. Now, I want to get into our main topic, and I want to look at dispensational. I can't believe I'm saying this on this podcast. I want to look at dispensationalism through an uncredible lens, and I want to analyze what J.D. Hall said, a couple of clips from that interview, maybe correct some things, and give a perspective that I don't think you're going to get anywhere else. And I'm saying that out loud, and I'm questioning it as I say it. I really don't think you're going to get this perspective from anywhere else, because as a former pastor who studied at that level, who has the degree on the wall right over there, I'm uniquely positioned to comment on this. And, this is the Uncredible Podcast, but what made me uncredible is this subject. So I kind of feel like I have an obligation to talk about it if it's going to come up this glaringly in the news. So let's get into our main topic. All right. And so what I want to do is I want to look at three portions of this interview. And I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to J.D. Hall. And on Tucker Carlson's most recent episode, I would also encourage you to look up Tucker Carlson's interview with Mike Huckabee. I know this is a lot, but also episode 7 that I did. I'm going to try to get those clips from episode 7 out soon too, just for this purpose specifically. But the first thing I wanted to comment on was right out of the gate, J.D. Hall starts trying to link dispensationalism and even classic dispensationalism to John Nelson Darby and C.I. Scofield. I think from Hall's perspective, he was starting to explain the background. And it's sort of like, here's some history, here's some of the tenets of dispensationalism. And I think he may have gotten back to it if Tucker hadn't asked other questions, but they kind of trailed off. But the way it came across when I was listening to it was unfortunate, because it ended up appearing to be like an exercise in a genetic fallacy. Now, the genetic fallacy is when you look at the origins of how something started, and then 100 years later, 120 years later, it may have morphed or changed, and it doesn't look anything like that, but we're going to disregard it because of how it was formed or how it came about. And so that, I think JD was just giving a historical context and trying to bring up some of the big names, and I think he got derailed a little bit because Tucker was, interested in certain aspects, and so he was sort of in a great way trying to merge history and theology and how it developed. He got derailed and never really got back to it. So, but unfortunately, this kind of struck me as like a genetic fallacy. And the reason it was unfortunate is when I went to seminary, I went to Baptist Bible Seminary, which later changed its name to Summit University and then Clark Summit University, because they got sued for stealing Summit. And then they later closed. Long story short, when I was in seminary studying for my master's degree, one of my required classes, there was no way around it, I tried to avoid it, it was taught by the president of the seminary at the time, was a class on dispensationalism. And I told the professor, I was like, listen, I'm coming into this class in opposition to dispensationalism. And we had a great conversation. He was like, that's fine. He was like, there's a lot of people at the time who were moving away from it. There's a lot of Reformed Baptist theology was moving was gaining traction. He was aware of it, and he was confident in his belief that he could convince me. He said, just take the class honestly, do the assignments. He's like, the end result of taking this class is not that you have to accept dispensationalism, but that you study it. And I thought, well, that's fair. So I did. I went into it with this understanding that I'm going to ask the questions that are being asked. The vast majority of the students were dispensational. The professor was staunchly dispensational, very classic dispensational, which even at the time, this was back in 2014, 2014, I went to seminary all the way into 2015, I think. I'd have to look at the dates. It doesn't matter. But the class started out, like the class began with a similar history, talking about John Nelson Darby, C.I. Scofield, Clarence Larkin, some of the old school dispensationalists, historic dispensationalists. And at the end of that, it was like, you're going to hear people use this in defense against dispensationalism, and this is not necessarily what we believe. And so the first objection at the seminary level that was addressed was this one. And then we immediately turned our attention to Charles Ryrie's 1995 reprint of, I think it was an article or something he did back in the 60s called Dispensationalism. And our textbook, I think this had a 2007 reprint as well, but our textbook for the class became a book called Dispensationalism by Charles Ryrie. My biggest disappointment with the interview with Tucker was that we never got to the conversation about Ryrie. And it's so critical to having a proper defense against dispensationalism as somebody who studied in a dispensational school. It is the key. I'm telling you, it's the key, is you have to read that book and deal with it. And if you read that book, you will have the tools to deal with it, because you'll be able to make sense of some of the problems that it creates. Now, I don't even have my copy of the book anymore, but I was able to find and highlight and cross-reference all the errors that I found in that book and address those at the seminary level. And I also found that it didn't matter. Okay, so we'll get back to that. But in a small church where I tried to deal with this, nobody was interested in talking about dispensationalism. You start throwing terms around like that, and like I said earlier, people's eyes glaze over. And at the seminary level, people were so entrenched in their belief system, they wouldn't be convinced otherwise. So my biggest disappointment was that we never really got to see JD flesh out this further into the 90s and the 2000s, because that is really what currently, I think, is still permeating small evangelical churches, and even guys like Pete Hegseth, Ted Cruz, Mike Huckabee. I'm telling you, they all believe the version of dispensationalism, whether they even know the term, right? And they would look at it as an end times theology. They wouldn't. Nobody talks about it as dispensationalism. That's why it's weird to hear this term in the news. But the fact that we didn't even talk about Charles Ryrie and didn't even get into the discussion of the three essentials or sine qua nons was unfortunate, because in order to have a proper conversation about this subject, you kind of have to, and in order to give a proper defense against it, in order to really put a crack in the dispensationalist viewpoint, you have to deal with that. And if you can deal with it, I think we can break it down, but most people don't want to have these conversations. However, if a guy like Tucker Carlson is asking you these questions, then that's the opportunity to break that open and start cracking that egg. But maybe JD doesn't know, or maybe he didn't have time to get to it. So that was like my first sort of assessment was, I'm like, okay, he's starting with Darby and Scoffield, and I felt like maybe he was about to turn the corner, and then he didn't. We just sort of trash talked C.I. Scofield for a little while and talked about how Israel may have, how Oxford or Israel may have like influenced him, and then it just sort of, it went a different direction where he started explaining dispensationalism in a way that I thought was kind of rough, but it's you can't explain dispensationalism in a way that's not rough. So that's that. So now I want to share a clip, and then we'll talk about it. Let me get this dialed up here. This is where it gets tough with my setup. So let me look at this clip here. And in this clip, Tucker asks J.D. Hall, who's actively standing against dispensationalism. Let me play the clip and then we'll talk about it.
Is there any popular Protestant American Christian leader who is explicitly rejecting dispensationalism and all that its political implications?
So what's happening in evangelicalism is a complete fracturing of the movement as a whole, so that the big name leaders like your John MacArthur's and your R.C. Sprouls, those guys are dead, basically, is what's happening. So there's a balkanization that's basically happening in American Protestantism and evangelicalism.
So it was very interesting, his answer to this question. The specific question was, is there anybody who's actively against dispensational, just teaching against it? And in a sense, I guess, I honestly wouldn't know. But what I would know is that dispensationalism does not present as dispensationalism in higher church. It just doesn't. That's just not what happens. It's presented as an eschatology, which is a study of the end times. The rapture, probably the biggest, most well-known dispensational. Again, this is why it would have been good for him to have gotten further into Ryrie, because after Ryrie, you get the Left Behind series, and you get, 9, 12 books of the Left Behind series, and you can't understate that fiction further propagating. I mean, these were number one best-selling books. Most of them were. And in the Christian community, these books were talking about the end times in a way, I don't know when it was, but missing that. So you've got Ryrie in the 90s. There's a conversation we'll talk about here in a little bit between MacArthur and Ryrie, also in the 90s. And then there's the Ligonier ministry movement, the Reformed Presbyterian movement that started to get pretty strong. But then in the 2000s, you've got this Left Behind series that is just further propagating the dispensational. You don't hear, probably not once would you have heard the term dispensationalism. And I mentioned in episode 7 that the biggest guy who promotes it is Dr. David Jeremiah. So what's interesting to me is I quit looking at this subject matter and this discussion back in 2016, and I don't think much has changed in terms of who you would talk about. And it's funny to me that J.D. Hall immediately says that the people that you would think of who would be standing against this, like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul. Listen, J.D. Hall, this is where this got difficult for me. As somebody who objectively was in this conversation back then, I was a nobody. Uncredible then, uncredible now. But I was in the middle of this back then, and I'll tell you the answer to this question. There's one answer. There's one answer to somebody who is standing up against dispensationalism explicitly. But they wouldn't be standing up against dispensationalism. They'd be standing up against a premillennial view of the end times. And the answer to that question is James White and Jeff Durbin of Apologia Church and Studios. James White has his own thing called Dividing Line as well. It's interesting that he doesn't even bring up their names. He does bring up two other, I would say obscure, maybe they're bigger than I realized, that I didn't recognize. So I'm not going to get into something that I don't even know about. So if you want to listen to that and check those things out, go for it. I might. We'll see. But JD, knowing personally James White, I don't know if he knows Jeff Durbin, but knowing James White, and they had a falling out back in the day, knowing him and not making it very clear that there is one guy who would be more than qualified. Yeah, it's true that he would not be like the level of R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur, but to pick John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul over James White for this conversation is interesting. And I'll tell you why. Because, first of all, as he noted, they're both dead. So is there anyone actively, currently big name person against it? No, they're dead. Okay. Worse, John MacArthur, for all intents and purposes, was a dispensationalist. He would call it dispensationalist light. And him and R.C. Sproul had this weird relationship where they agreed on Calvinism. which is a view of salvation. And I think Sproul preferred to set the dispensational conversation aside and elevate the salvation conversation. And this goes back into the 90s, where Macarthur and Ryrie, the guy who wrote the book, literally wrote the textbook for the class that I took at a seminary level. He and Ryrie had a back and forth of 2 books, and it was this conversation of lordship salvation. And nobody knew that what was at the root of it, I shouldn't say nobody, but nobody in regular public life knew that what was really at the root of that was a difference in dispensational theology and how they fleshed that out. And Macarthur never went so far as Ryrie did with his belief in dispensationalism, but he was a dispensationalist. And if you look up prominent dispensationalists, like who teaches it today, Macarthur comes up. So it's weird that he chose Macarthur, but Macarthur was a prominent Baptist. The Master's Seminary in California is a big seminary. I'm pretty sure they teach some kind of dispensationalism. They certainly teach premillennial eschatology, which is end times. I'm sure they do. Rapture, God still has some plan for the Jews. That's the position of a light dispensationalism. And then R.C. Sproul, who is Presbyterian. Now, R.C. Sproul is one of my favorite theologians of all time, but he had the opportunity to walk this road. And I think he made an active decision not to deal with the issue of dispensationalism for the reason that a lot of people don't want to deal with it. One, you get really deep into the weeds. It presents itself as primarily an end times theology. And so when you're talking about Christianity as a whole, eschatology is sort of like, we don't really know. We're all doing our best, and so we can set this one off to the side. But if we're talking about salvation, this is more important. So I think RC made the decision to say, let's not die on the battle hill of eschatology when I've got this stalwart of justification by faith alone, lordship, salvation, John Macarthur. They team up and they start doing stuff together. They became really good friends. But what's interesting is prior to his friendship and relationship with Macarthur growing and building from the early 90s into the 2000s, R.C. Sproul was heavily promoting Dr. John Gerstner, who was one of his professors in college. And Dr. Gerstner, I think, is the only person that I'm aware of who ever directly went after dispensationalism as a theological, he would have considered it a heretical position. Now, I'm sure there were other people who have done it, but John Gerstner's book, Wrongly Dividing the Word of Truth, was a direct address to all the issues that we're talking about. And he kind of nailed Macarthur in that book. Like, he kind of pointed out that this dispensational theology is problematic on so many levels. But the problem with Sproul and Gerstner is they were coming at it from a perspective of Presbyterians, not Baptist. And so Baptist's perspective of a Presbyterian, because they have different views on baptism and infant baptism, they're not going to respect those teachings from someone else. Because if you got it so wrong on Baptist, this is how a Baptist would think. If you got it so wrong on baptism, how much more did you get it wrong? So it's tough for a guy. But John Gerstner's book, Wrongly Dividing, is one of the, it's hard to find. I mean, I don't know if you can get it anymore. I don't know if Ligonier publishes that anymore. But Gerstner clearly saw this theological problem and how it permeated all aspects of theology. And Sproul made a conscious decision, I think, at the end of Gerstner's life to say, hey, we're not going to make Presbyterians and Baptists can unify on justification by faith, on Calvinism as well. And Ligonier can bring all these sort of Baptists in and start teaching them theology. And Macarthur made the same choice. He was like, I can make this I can die on this battlefield of dispensationalism, which to them I think was generally just an eschatology more than anything, and focus on these other more important issues. And that's the subtle way that dispensationalism creeps into anyone's theology. It's sort of tacked on at the end of the doctrinal statement as, God still has a plan for Israel and then the end times. And most people, they start getting into that and they're just like, sure, you've done the research, pastor. You theologian, you've done all that research. That's getting into the weeds for me. So what I found interesting is J.D. Hall, when asked specifically who would be the biggest, most prominent people who would oppose dispensationalism, and the answer to that is James White and Jeff Durbin. I mean, I haven't followed the whole thing, but I don't know that there's any controversy. I looked very briefly. Both James White and Jeff Durbin are both still doing their ministries effectively as they have when I was doing it, looking at them decades ago. And more so with, you figure dispensationalism is about 200 years old, maybe 150 years old, give or take. I don't know. I don't know the whole timeline. It's barely a century. It's barely 2 centuries old. And James White has been doing the dividing line for half a century. So who's best positioned to address it? And they're linked up. So Apologia and James White and Jeff Durbin are all linked in some way. I thought, last I knew, James White was like sort of like a pastor emeritus or something. He was part of that church, Reformed Baptist Church. Who else is there? There might be other people, but to me, the fact that he didn't name them, even in passing, was just kind of surprising. And really, I think the best person, I could be wrong about this, but I think the best person to address this issue would be Jeff Durbin. I don't know how he would do. He would definitely nail the eschatology side. I don't know how he would be on the actual dispensational teachings specifically, but I think Jeff Durbin would be the best guy. I don't know James White's background with dispensationalism, but he would be fine. He would be more than fine. And the reason I say that is because, as far as I'm aware, and maybe this has changed since then, but J.D. Hall did okay on the Tucker Carlson show. I think he did great. He did fine. But he comes with the baggage of his history, where James White and Jeff Durbin, active ministries, no scandals, would have been perfect. And you wouldn't have this immediate, now let me say this. The reason I picked Jeff Durbin over James White is because there is like a group of people on social media and in the interwebs that just hate James White for how he talks. He does, for some people, come off a little bit arrogant, like a know-it-all. He's got that boomer feel to him too, which rubs people the wrong way. He doesn't care, so he just says, but I mean, he has the knowledge base and the expertise, and he would work really well on a show like Tucker Carlson, but so would Jeff Durbin. So I'm just blown away. I'm not blown away. So this is where you get into the question of why J.D. Hall again. It's like he's going to reference R.C. Sproul, who specifically whether he made a conscious decision or an unconscious decision, chose not to take dispensationalism on when it mattered, which would have been a decade ago, and to call out this issue of Israel and the church and elevating Israel in that theology. And then Macarthur, who he might not have been a full-on dispensationalist, but would have still felt and held. I mean, you could probably go to his commentaries today and see that God still has a plan for Israel. So it's just kind of confusing that those would be the guys you would mention. And the reason that JD doesn't mention James White is because they had a falling out. And so I looked it up because I'm like, surely James White has something to say. And apparently he deleted a tweet. This reads just like it used to. But he says, I see the trolls are active today. Guess that's not unusual. My point about Hall was, for those who think and know a little of his history, I sadly know way too much of it. My point was obvious. After crashing and burning his ministry and the church he pastored, getting in trouble with the law, and admitting to drug addiction, Hall disappeared and allegedly moved quietly to a farm. Essentially, the point is J.D. Hall is not the best person to have this conversation because of his history and his track record. So, and that is why he doesn't mention them. And it's kind of unfortunate, because what would have been nice here is if J.D. Hall had said, some other guys that may not like me saying it would be Jeff Durbin and James White. You know, if he had just mentioned them and then led Tucker to other people who would be adequate in addressing this, It would have been great, but he didn't do that. And I think that's because there's still some issues there. But I mean, here's the deal. The answer to Tucker's question is James White and Jeff Durbin. That's it. I mean, I don't know how you could come up with a different question. I'm sure somebody will argue with me, but for me personally, that's immediately who I thought of. Now, on this clip, and then we'll move on, another great question that didn't get asked, which I would have loved to have heard the answer to, would have been, what prominent people are explicitly promoting dispensationalism? Because this is where it gets weird. Not too many people explicitly teach it, right? It always emerges as an end times study. That's not that important, but it's important, And then God has a plan for Israel, and then it goes down that, and just trust me on this. And I don't know how you get away from Dr. David Jeremiah not being the one guy that's still alive who teaches and promotes this. There might be others, but it's going to be interesting to see in the coming weeks how those people emerge. Because now because J.D. Hall and Tucker Carlson talked about it, it can't masquerade as if you don't agree with it, or God's always had a plan for Israel, or if you don't agree with it, you're an anti-Semite. Now they have to actually address the subject from a theological standpoint. It'd be interesting to see how people like that and who emerges to do that. So I'm kind of curious about that, but that would have been a good question for Tucker to ask. So I've got one more clip, and then I want to get into Ryrie Sinquinons. This is going to be a long one, guys. JD got into this whole conversation about polemics and how he kind of made it seem like this conversation is new. It's only new because of the war in Iran. For the most part, people they were able to hold their end times view and believe that this country over there, Israel, wasn't that big of a deal, or didn't really need to be talked about, and God had a plan for them, but they were over there, and they could hold on to their fiction, whatever their view of the fiction of the Left Behind series was, and believe that was theological and biblical. They could hold on to that. Now it has real, genuine political ramifications. People are dying. America's close to, boots on the ground, war. This is all real now. And when you start to see a theology that aligns with where this is going, man, it gets really ugly really fast. So let me get into the second. But he talked about polemics, and it was weird because he made it sound like this is just like an emerging conversation. This has been going on the entire time. Dispensationalism has been out there. It has had its detractors. Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I already mentioned the conversations with Gerstner. This goes back to the 90s and Ryrie. There have been countless debates about this. It has been brought up. Reformed Baptists just haven't been successful in beating it, so or slowing it down, so to speak, and it's just taken root. Let me get into clip number 2 here, because I want to talk about his comments about Huckabee and his 2 options. So let me play this, and then we'll talk about it.
And you would think that Mike Huckabee would know, as he quotes Genesis 12:3, that Galatians 3 specifically says that's not for Jews. So then you're left with one of 2 options. The first one is Mike Huckabee, a Baptist minister, knows his Bible. The Bible says in Galatians 3, Paul says, I'm not talking about Jews. It's not about Jews. That verse is about Jesus. And the promises are for Christians. They're the heirs of the promise. That's option A. He knows that, but he's lying. The other option is he genuinely doesn't know that. He's totally ignorant. He's never, ever read Galatians in his life. I don't think that's really plausible.
So this is interesting because basically he gives Huckabee 2 options. And my take on Mike Huckabee is that he was a classic, probably trained, I'm sure he has seminary or whatever, but he was a classic preacher that I dealt with who didn't like to get into the weeds of theology that much. And I'm sure he studied these things. I mentioned in episode 7 where he started going down his little rabbit hole, and then Tucker cut him off. He had sort of like a sermon, I think it was people, place, purpose, that kind of a thing. But there is a third option. And this is where this interview got a little bit conspiratorial. And I want to say definitively, as somebody who has studied under the people who actually believe this, the third option is they really believe this is what the Bible teaches. They do. They really believe it. And the problem that anyone trying to argue with a dispensationalist is that generally the dispensationalist is going to agree with everything you say, but they have this one little caveat. And that one little caveat is in the church age. In the church age. And so any theology that you've come to, they're going to argue that that is true now, but it's not true forever. And, you know, one of the issues here is that you say, oh, well, these promises aren't for them. It's like, yeah, I think how Huckabee would handle that is he would say, yeah, during this church age, and J.D. Hall knows this because he explained it in this episode, how dispensationalists look at the church as a parenthetical. God has a different purpose and a plan right now for the Gentiles and the church specifically. And so, like, this would actually be a really easy defense for Mike Huckabee. But all dispensationalists read New Testament passages like that through this parenthetical lens, and they understand that these passages are understood for the church during the church age. And so having that framework built in, they look at it as, like, yeah, of course, like, they look at it as God has a plan for Israel and he's going to finish that plan for Israel, but right now we're in the church age. And so you would say, like, oh, well, this New Testament passage, Galatians, for example, says that those promises weren't just for the children of Abraham, it's for all people. It's like, yeah, that's now for this time frame, but that's going to change. And this is where it gets so important that you talk about Charles Ryrie's book and his 3 sine qua nons, which are essentials for dispensationalism, because Ryrie had 3 essentials that he focused on. One was a distinction between God's purposes with Israel and the church. So that God, you have to believe, if you're going to be a dispensationalist, that God has a different plan, or a separate plan. I shouldn't say different, but a separate plan for the people of Israel and the church. Number 2, a literal, historical, grammatical interpretation of Scripture. I think they fall apart on this one because they argue that they come to this position through this, and I think that's easily debunked, but I think that they love to talk about how they're taking the Bible literally, when the fact of the matter is everyone tries to do this. Whenever somebody sees allegory in the Bible, particularly a covenant theologian, they call it out and say, see, we're historical, grammatical. But at the same time, those people will look at them when they come to the book of Revelation and go, like, how is that literal? How is that? So that one, I kind of like to dodge that one because I think everyone is trying that. But then there's this third one. And I remember when I got to this point in my study of that class in seminary, where we were talking about how this was essential for Charles Ryrie, that God's glory is God's singular defining purpose. And they talk about how, and that tracks, right? If you said, what is God's goal in all of this? It's to get himself glory. I started saying that God's central and defining purpose was salvation to his glory. And the reason for that is because I think you can prove that scripturally. And I think this is the point at which dispensationalists are able to do what they do with the time frames. If they can say God has multiple purposes, then they can separate the church in Israel, and they can take their eschatology, and which comes first, the chicken or the egg. They get there this way. How they get there is, probably different for different people. But this was the one thing I had never heard of after 4 years of Bible college and multiple, I think this was towards the end of my seminary time as well. It was the first time I had seen that. And I'm like, I remember honing in on that and thinking, that right there is the problem. And so I started addressing it. And I remember when I finally came to a verse that established this for me. And I had actually already come to this verse. I just hadn't really made it a big issue. I got to pull it up because I didn't have it ready. Here we go. Uncredible. So when I was in Greek class, let's see if I can. You know what the problem is? I use my phone for this stuff, and my phone's up there. So should be able to get it like that. Yeah, there we go. Let's do that. See if that'll change it. Okay, so when I was in Greek class, I had to study. We had to pick for my last semester of Greek, I had to pick a passage to study. And I made it a point to pick a passage that I had never dealt with. And the passage I chose was Ephesians 2:11 to probably 16. Yeah, I think it was probably just verse 16. And our objective was, it might have gone a little further, but our objective was to interpret this, use all the Greek that we had learned and interpret this passage. And I was like, I don't want to use, there's a lot of common passages, but I didn't want to use one that I had already had a background in. So I picked this passage, and this passage absolutely destroyed dispensationalism for me. Now, keep in mind, I had just read Gerstner's book. I was questioning these things along the way. And I have to pick apart and study for like 4 months of this singular passage, which, by the way, everyone knows Ephesians 2:8 and 9, which is the classic, for by grace you have been saved through faith, that not of your own doing. It's a gift of God, not a result of works, that no man may boast. Everyone knows that verse. Nobody can quote this verse. I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people, average churchgoers, have ever heard a sermon on this verse, have ever heard it talked about. And I'll tell you why. Because it destroys dispensationalism. Ephesians 2:11. Here we go. Keep it slow. Therefore, remember that at one time, you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision. Right? You were Gentiles, called that by the Jews, which is made by the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time, talking about the old covenant, separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Like, in the flesh, you guys weren't part of this thing. That's how it used to be. By the way, interestingly, in Ephesians 2:12, the very beginning, remember that you were at that time separated from, not Israel, Christ, which suggests that Christ was the fulfillment of those promises, and they were in Christ then. It's important when you start looking at how we divide the Bible. Okay, so remember at that time you were separated from Christ, Ephesians 2:13. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace. So he, Christ, is our peace, Jew and Gentile both, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. When I studied that particular verse, there's 2 more verses, but when I studied that particular verse, I thought the Apostle Paul is linking the crucifixion to this subject in such a way that this hostility between Jew and Gentile was part of the primary purpose of Christ on the cross, and therefore the primary purpose of God in seeking his glory. So the central and defining purpose of God is salvation, his glory in salvation. Not, I have multiple purposes and I'm trying to do different things. This is his central and defining purpose. He defines his people by this. And you say, oh, why did Jesus die on the cross? For our sins. And also to bring both Jew and Gentile peace, and to make them 2 separate teams, 2 separate groups. No, one. To make them one. By abolishing the law, this is great, Ephesians 2:15, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the 2, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Like, classic Pauline theology is that in Christ, there is no more of this separation between Jew and Gentile. That is a fundamental, as J.D. Hall pointed out, that is a fundamental affront to what is currently Judaism and the Jewish religion. They would not be okay with that. And it is in direct contradiction to what dispensationalists teach, that God has a separate, different, distinct plan to get his glory through Israel. No, he doesn't. He fundamentally, in Christ, says he doesn't. And the way for a Gentile and a Jew to, or all people, in their context, that's how they would say it, to be a Christian is through Christ. And the reason this is important, now they would say, this is a verse that's in the New Testament and you're getting into the weeds. If you understood the dispensations, you would understand that Paul is only talking about the church. That's how they would frame the argument, that Paul's only talking about the church age. This becomes a very serious and difficult problem when you come to their perspective of the end times, because they believe, I talked about this in episode 7, along with Israel today, they believe that the temple is going to be reconstructed, and that in the end times that these sacrifices are going to be restarted, and God's going to refocus on, the whole Old Testament plan is going to come back and start over. You can't merge those two realities with this verse. And so it creates a very weird, so what I would say is, if you wanted to get a somebody who believes this theology, and maybe they don't even know it, but their end times is kind of broken and they believe like a premillennial position, the rapture, things like that, I would say, so I would agree with them. I would say, so you think the temple's going to be rebuilt in the end times, Christ is going to take the church out, just so we're clear, the church is going to leave, and God's going to refocus on Israel, he's going to reset up the sacrifices. Okay, so how does that work with Ephesians 2, verse 15? By abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man, so making peace. Like how, or, if you really wanted to get into the details, you could ask them to explain how the book of Hebrews is going to function in that new time frame. Or how will they be saved? Well, they're going to be saved because they're going to put their faith in Christ, and it'll be a different time. Okay, well, so if they put their faith in Christ, that makes them part of what? The church or Israel? And all of a sudden, when you start tying salvation, justification to these ideas about the end times and dispensationalism, you start realizing that this sine qua non, this idea that God gets his glory in multiple ways as opposed to a singular way through salvation and justification of all men by faith in Christ, when you start making that distinction, it puts them in a very weird place. And I think Ryrie in his book struggled with this, and I think he made the mistake of, I can't remember if he used the word mode or means, but they try to call this thing where it's like you get saved through faith in whatever the object would change, or the object doesn't change, but the mode changes. He does this weird thing where at the end of the day, he really tries to dodge the accusation that there are more than one way to get saved or more than one roads to salvation. And he doesn't get there. I don't think he gets there. He just says it, and it doesn't. At one point, I think the terminology got skewed a little bit for him. But all that to say this, the conversation about dispensationalism is not, by and large, it is not the way it was presented in Tucker's show. It is not a propaganda that was inserted into some small churches to gain support for Israel. People believe it. Okay, I can tell you at the highest level of seminary, the people teaching it, they believe it. They're convinced of it, and not for any political purpose. Now they might be leveraging it, like they might see the advantages of it, and they might see God working through that theology in supporting Israel. Like they might see that somehow, but they do believe it, and they believe it so much that I'll end on this story. They believe it so much that I went to a conference after I was done with dispensationalism, and I had been pastoring for a couple of years after seminary. There was a local pastor who was concerned about my rejection of dispensationalism, and he took me back to the college that I graduated from and took me to a conference on dispensationalism. And I remember all these old men sitting around, and they were all old men, discussing how they can reduce the influence at the time of Dr. John Piper because he was affecting somehow like this movement of reform. He was one of the more prominent Reformed Baptists in their mind. I'm not sure that Piper wasn't himself dispensational on some level. I never really looked into him on that level, but they were like, they cared so much about their theology and they thought it was the truth that they were looking at Piper and saying, like, how do we teach the truth in a captivating way, the way Piper does? Well, you would have to have the truth first. So that's where it gets difficult. So, but yeah, this is probably never going to happen again in terms of this podcast. I shouldn't say that. Next week, we'll probably right back into it. It'd be interesting to see how this conversation that J.D. Hall had with Tucker Carlson seeps into other media. I'm curious to see how that works. One thing I do know is it is being leveraged in some way at a political level for votes, for influence. And these people do believe it, right? Dispensationalists do believe it. There are regular people in churches today who believe this. And I do think it was a mistake for JD not to, whether it was a mistake or he just didn't have time, to not get into Ryrie and the fiction of Left Behind. Because I don't know how you can have a conversation about dispensationalism without, I mean, I think I could safely say that the Left Behind series was the biggest day dispensationalism ever had. I'm pretty sure. And to have a conversation about it and like, how did it get popular? Really? Like, hey Tucker, have you ever heard of the Left Behind series? Oh yeah. Was that dispensational? Yeah. Really? And then you can go down that road and talk about how influential that was, a fiction series based on Bible that people just took for truth. So yeah, so for the main topic, we look at the world through the uncredible lens, and I come to this. In order to effectively address dispensationalism, you have to understand that the central and defining purpose is God's salvation of men by faith alone in the person and work of Christ. If you do that, you can break down dispensationalism. And the thing is, they have to agree with that or step into the realm of heresy, which I think Gerstner was getting at with his book. It's been a while since I've read it, so I'd have to go back to it. But I also put here, while God may get his glory through other means, the primary, and it's important that you say this, defining purpose is salvation of all men in Christ. Because that is what defines us as, children of Abraham. That is the defining purpose of all ages, by the way. And you can, if you really want to get into the weeds, you can actually prove this for all the ages, and then the dispensationalism starts to fall apart. Because you say, oh, well, is that true in the Old Testament? Yeah, it works. It flows. Where instead of having a theology that, well, it was this way during when Abraham was here, and then when they set up the covenant, it was different. And then when Christ comes and we have the church age, it's different. And then when we get into the 7-year tribulation, it's different. And then when we get into the new heavens and new earth, it's different. It's all the same. It's all been in Christ. It's all been faith in Christ alone, period, end of conversation. And I think that tracks with Scripture. So let's wrap things up with our quote of the week. This is going to be our longest episode. I love it. Quote of the week. I'm skipping the podcast feature because of how long this is. I didn't have one anyway. There were some. I just don't like doing the repeat thing. But let's get into here's our quote of the week. Try to get this centered. What you think you can't do is often just the thing you need to try. What you think you can't do is often just the thing you need to try. And I picked that one because I ran into that when that's actually what made me decide to run on my birthday, a bunch of hills and some sections. I was like, I wonder if I can be the fastest time. And then I was like, no, just focus on your training. And then I saw that quote and I was like, I'm thinking I can't do it, so maybe I need to try it. But yeah, there might be something that you think you can't do that you do need to try. And sort of a podcast feature. It's not really a podcast feature, but I was listening to Chad Williams on Daryl. I think he was the one who followed me on How You Got Into Running conversation that he's having on his podcast. And Chad was talking about how he was in a really bad place, and he just had to decide like I need to do what I think I can't do, which for him was running. And for me, it's it's running marathons and hitting certain times with the marathon. It might be an ultra marathon down the road, but whatever you think you can't do, try it. Because what you'll find is, let's say you think you can't run a mile and you end up running half a mile. It's like, well, you just ran a half a mile. Or I can't run 5 miles, but you run 2 miles. You just ran 2 miles. So, if you set a goal and you don't hit it, but you hit something before that, you're on the road to hitting it. So what you think you can't do is often the thing you need to try. So get out there and try it. Let's close things out. As always, thanks for listening to the Uncredible Podcast. Remember to subscribe to the Substack at uncredible.me. Like and subscribe on YouTube and Spotify. I always say that because some people, I think, just watch it and they don't actually hit the like button, or they're subscribed to it and then they just watch the episodes. But, it helps if you subscribe to get the notifications, but also to like each episode so that it gets out there. So for Uncredible merch, we won't get crazy with this today. Check out merch.uncredible.me. And if you want to follow all the ins and outs of daily runs and videos and history stuff that sometimes, like I posted that Uncredible history photo at Jeremy Lundmark, both on Substack and on Instagram. You'll catch it there. As always, thanks for watching and for listening. And remember, stay uncredible.
We are the night shift, swing shift, day shift, no quit, no quit, no quit. Building their world while they talk about us, talk about us, talk about us. We are uncredible. We are the night shift, swing shift, day shift, no quit, no quit, no quit. We are the night shift, swing shift, day shift, no quit, no quit, no quit. Building their world while they talk about us, all they talk about us. Educated, experienced, still not credible, so we embraced it. Now we're uncredible.